You spend your whole life trying to become someone. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every act of discipline, you tell yourself, it is building you into something greater, a better version of the self, a stronger, purer, more polished you. And then you encounter a sentence from a man who spent his entire life inside the Quran, and the sentence undoes everything you thought the path was for. He says the destination was never to become someone. It was to become no one at all. Not erased, not destroyed, something far stranger and far more frightening at first than destruction. A disappearance that does not end you, but reveals what was underneath you the whole time. Most people think spiritual growth is addition, more prayer, more knowledge, more discipline, stacked onto the self like bricks onto a tower, until eventually the tower reaches the sky. It isn't addition, it's subtraction, and the final subtraction is the hardest one, because the last thing standing between you and your Lord is not your sins, it's you. There is a very old, very dangerous, very misunderstood teaching buried inside Islamic spirituality about exactly this. By the end of this, you will understand why the greatest obstacle on the path to Allah was never the world outside you, it was the I inside you. And you will understand why the mystics called its death the only real beginning. The man who mapped this territory most rigorously was Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi, the 12th century Andalusian mystic, whom later scholars would simply call Al-Shakar Lakbar, the greatest master. In two towering works, Fuchsia's Al-Hikam, the bezels of wisdom, and the vast Futuhat, Al-Makkiyah, the Meccan openings, he did something almost no one before him had attempted with such precision. He did not just describe closeness to Allah as a feeling, he mapped it as a structure, stages, deaths, and returns, each with its own signs, its own dangers, and its own gift. It should be said plainly, in the spirit of honesty rather than hype, Ibn Arabi is not a figure of easy consensus. His language of the oneness of being, later systematized by his students as what it awujed, has been embraced by giants of the Islamic tradition and fiercely contested by others, including scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah, who feared it could be misread as collapsing the distinction between creator and creation. That tension is not a footnote to hide. It is part of what makes this territory worth walking carefully. What is not contested is the psychological and spiritual phenomenon he was trying to describe, because the Quran itself points to it, and every serious tradition of Islamic spirituality, from Ghazali to Rumi to Ibn al-Qayyim, circles the same event from different angles, a death that happens before the body dies, the death of the ego, the nafs that insists it is the center of the room. Here is what most people think ego death means, if they've heard the phrase at all: humility. Being modest, not bragging, thinking less of yourself. That is not what the mystics are describing. That is ego management. The ego still fully intact, simply behaving politely. A humble ego is still an ego. It has just learned better manners. What Ibn Arabi is describing is not behavioral. It is ontological. It is the direct, lived recognition that the I you have been protecting, feeding, defending, and building your entire life, the one that says my prayer, my effort, my sin, my virtue was never the true actor in the story at all. It was a veil mistaking itself for a face, and veils do not improve. Veils are removed. The first death is the smallest and the hardest, because it looks, from the outside, like nothing has happened at all. It is the death of ownership. You pray, and some part of you quietly logs the prayer as an achievement. You give charity, and some part of you files it under things I have done. You resist a sin, and something in you exhales with quiet pride. I did not fall. Ibn Arabi's teaching cuts directly into this reflex. Every motion, every breath, every act of obedience is, in the deepest sense, a divine act occurring through you, not an achievement accumulated by you. You did not create your own capacity to want good. You did not manufacture the moment of guidance that turned your heart toward prayer in the first place. You were given the desire, given the strength, given the opening, and then, quietly, you claimed authorship of the gift. This is the first meaning of the ego's death, not that you stop acting, but that you stop believing the actions were ever yours to hold on to in the first place. Watch how the Quran itself performs this correction, over and over. It was not you who threw when you threw, but Allah who threw a single verse that reaches into the middle of a battlefield and quietly removes the soldier's hand from his own arrow. If a verse can do that to an arrow in mid-flight, what can it do to your prayer, your patience, your 40 years of trying to be good? The second death goes deeper, and this is where the ground starts to genuinely shift under the reader's feet. It is not enough, Ibn Arabi says, to stop claiming ownership of your actions. Eventually, the seeker must confront something more unsettling, that the very qualities they take pride in, their intelligence, their strength, their sabr, their generosity, are not independently theirs either. They are borrowed reflections of names that belong to Allah alone. Your patience is a flicker of Al-Sabr. Your knowledge is a borrowed spark of Al-Alim. Your mercy toward your children is a thimble dipped into an ocean called Al-Rahman. This is where the mystics use a word that sounds almost violent. Fana, annihilation, extinction, passing away. Not the annihilation of your body. The annihilation of the illusion that your attributes were self-generated rather than reflected. Think of a mirror standing in sunlight. The mirror does not manufacture the light. It does not own the light. It cannot take credit for the warmth on your skin. It simply happens to be positioned in such a way that light passes through it and reaches you. The mystic's claim is this: you are the mirror. You have simply spent your whole life believing you were the sun. There is a strange, almost eerie parallel here to something physics has quietly known for a century. Ask a physicist what you are made of at the smallest scale, and the honest answer is unsettling. Not a fixed, solid thing at all, but a temporary pattern of energy, borrowed matter, on loan from a universe that will eventually reclaim every atom. Not one particle in your body is truly yours in any permanent sense. You did not create the carbon in your bones or the oxygen in your blood. You are, in the most literal physical sense, a pattern arranged for a while, then returned. Modern psychology, studying what researchers call ego dissolution, the temporary quieting of the brain's default mode network, the part of you that constructs the ongoing story of I, me, mine, has found something the mystics described 1,000 years earlier without a single scanner. When that self-referential narrator goes quiet, people do not report emptiness. They report the opposite: connection, vastness, a sense that the boundary they had mistaken for a wall was, in fact, a door. The mystics were not speaking metaphorically when they described the ego as a veil. They were describing, with startling precision, a structure that both physics and neuroscience would later stumble onto from entirely different directions, that the solid, separate self is far less solid and far less separate than it insists on feeling. The final death is the one Ibn Arabi approaches with the most caution, because it is here that language itself starts to strain and break. If the first death removes ownership, and the second death removes the illusion of independent attributes, the third death confronts the seeker with the most disorienting question of all: was there ever, in truth, a fully separate you standing over here, gazing at a fully separate Allah, standing over there, two independent existences, side by side? Or was that apparent separateness itself the final and most stubborn veil? This is Fana al-Fana, the annihilation of the annihilation, the point where even the awareness of having been annihilated dissolves, because there is no longer a separate watcher left to notice the disappearance. What Ibn Arabi calls Baka subsistence begins exactly here, Not a new self replacing the old one, but the recognition that what remains, what has always remained beneath every borrowed attribute and every claimed action, was never a second, competing existence at all. It was being itself, in the only form being has ever truly taken. This is precisely the terrain scholars warn about most carefully, and rightly so, because stated carelessly, this can curdle into something the Quran forbids outright, the claim that creation is the creator, that the servant literally dissolves into godhood. That is not what the careful reading of Ibn Arabi's students defends. The distinction they insist on is delicate but essential. The servant does not become Allah. The servant's illusion of standing as an independent, self-sufficient rival existence, the small, defensive I, is what dies. What was never other than a reflection simply stops mistaking itself for a source. A wave does not become the ocean by dying. A wave was ocean the entire time. Its death is only the end of its confusion about where it ends and the water begins. Now turn this back on yourself, because that is the only place this teaching was ever meant to land. Every time you have said my success, some quiet architecture in you has quietly built a small kingdom, with you crowned at the center of it. Every time you have compared your religion to someone else's, measured your prayer against theirs, felt the flicker of superiority pass through your chest, that was the ego, still very much alive, wearing the costume of piety. Every time you have collapsed in shame over a sin, unable to move past it, unable to accept forgiveness and continue, look closely at that too. Sometimes what feels like humility is actually the ego in its most subtle disguise, still convinced that it is important enough, central enough, large enough, that its failure deserves this much attention. The ego does not only inflate, it also collapses. Both directions keep it exactly where it wants to be, at the center of the story. You were not put on this earth to become impressive to yourself. You were not put here to curate a self-worth admiring, not even a pious self. You were put here to discover that the self was never the point. The self was the veil, and you have been polishing the veil, calling it worship your entire life. This should terrify you for exactly one breath, and then it should do something else entirely. Because if the ego is not a treasure to protect but a veil to remove, then every failure of the ego, every collapsed plan, every humiliation, every moment life stripped something you were proud of directly out of your hands, was never punishment. It was maintenance. Every hardship that Allah places in your path is, in this light, not cruelty but precision surgery on exactly the tissue that needed to be cut away, the part of you insisting it could stand on its own. The believer who understands this stops experiencing loss as pure tragedy and begins to feel, underneath the grief, something almost like relief, one more layer of the veil, gone. This is why the mystics do not describe Fana with dread in their later writings, but with a kind of exhausted, grateful peace. Because the self you were so afraid of losing was never you. It was standing in your way, and its death does not leave a hole. It leaves room. You began this searching for the moment ego dies, expecting, perhaps, an ending, a void, a subtraction with nothing left on the other side. But subtraction, done all the way to the end, is not annihilation, it is arrival. Ibn Arabi did not spend his life mapping a death for its own sake. He spent his life mapping a homecoming, the long, slow, often unbearable process of a wave forgetting, and then remembering that it was ocean the entire time. You will not finish this process today, perhaps not this year, perhaps not in this life. The ego does not surrender in a single moment. It dies in layers, again and again, each time you catch it claiming credit, each time you catch it comparing, each time you catch it collapsing into a shame that is still, quietly, about itself. But every time you notice it, that noticing is the death beginning. Again, small, unglamorous, real, you did not come here to become someone impressive before Allah. You came here too. Stop standing in front of him, and on the day the veil finally fully falls, you will not experience it as loss.